Hey there, Daniel. How you doing?
I'm good. How you doing, John?
I am doing well. Um, we've been having some good conversations along this topic of politics, Jesus, and related to this book that you and I wrote together on trying to follow Jesus in a politically divided world and honor him more than just honor maybe the spirit of America. So it's been good conversations, I think, so far.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and on this episode of the podcast, we want to dive into a really a framework that you have developed for thinking through some of these crucial, important kind of political, cultural, ethical issues. And we're going to dive into a very specific example of that. But to set that up, to kind of begin helping us think that through, uh, just to get us started, let's talk about right and wrong, and not what is right and wrong, but how do people often decide what is right and wrong? Like, what is it that really guides people in their thinking about right and wrong, and how do they make these kinds of decisions?
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like a lot of people try to figure out what's right and wrong kind of by their gut. Just kind of like what feels right. And I mean, obviously Romans 2, there's some validity to, I mean, we do know some things based on God giving us, his moral law within. But hey, Romans 2 is followed up by Romans 3. I think that's where it talks about how, none of us are righteous and no, not one. So is that right, John?
Yeah,
Romans 3.
yeah,
All of
yeah.
sin, fall,
Romans 3.
so yeah, we may have the moral law within, but we're all, equally, universally struggling with obeying it. So anyway, I would say
Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceptively, deceitful above all things. Who can understand it? So yes, there is some, I think, inherent hardwiring towards right and wrong, but outside of Eden, our hardwiring the wires have gotten crossed.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, totally. Well, and I would say that, a lot of, okay, I'm going to get philosophical for just a second. If the question is kind of like, how do people figure out what is right and wrong? There are different schools of thought out there. You have the virtue ethics, which basically says you figure out what's right and wrong by being a virtuous person, and then those, the right actions will follow. So focus on the character. You've also got, the Kantian deontological. I just lost half of our audience by saying that, but the idea that we need to look at the the rule, the kind of a rule based ethics, and regardless of what consequences happen, you just do your duty. You've also got kind of a consequentialist way of looking at what right and wrong is, and that's basically, well, if you want to figure out what's right, then look at the consequences. And if it's good consequences, then it's a right action. If it's bad consequences, then it's a bad action. So consequentialism, also, utilitarianism is part of that. Greatest good for the greatest number of people. So there are lots of ways that people have said, this is how we figure out what's right and wrong. I'd say most people tend to be consequentialists in their day to day. It's like, I'll do what's right in terms of the, if the effects are good, then I'll say, yeah, that was good.
yeah. Do you feel like that shapes even some of their decisions politically?
Totally.
Politics.
Totally. Yeah. I think that's where most people start.
Yeah. Like, well, I think this will have better implications, better consequences for the country, better consequences for my life. So I'm going to vote for, or I think this policy is better because I feel like that's going to, in the long run, have better consequences down the line. Is that kind of what I'm hearing you say?
And if you have a debate with somebody politically, and they're like, well, we obviously can't vote for this person because these bad things will happen. And I'm like, well, you obviously can't vote for that person because these awful things. Those consequentialist debates don't really go that far usually. So often that's when you go up to the next level and you'll say, well, hey, the Bible does say this or that. Yeah. And they might say, well, yeah, but the Bible also says this or that. So it's pretty tough to gain unity around these things when we're mainly starting with a consequentialist perspective, and we mainly just want things to work out well.
But consequences do matter.
They do.
Right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So what's wrong with consequentialism then? If consequences do matter and our choices and our decisions and our thoughts about some of the things do have consequences, would you say there's something, I mean, it's consequential. Is it wrong? Is it a wrong approach or?
Well, I would agree that consequences are important, and we can even find some logic in the Bible that is consequentialist. You look at the book of Proverbs, and it's like, hey, if you do this, then this bad thing will happen, so don't do that. But I would also say that we need to ground that logic, as the Bible does, in an even more important principle, and that would be the commands of the Bible. And I would say that even that needs to be grounded as Jesus showed us in the character of God. So, I mean, consequences are important, but if they're ungrounded from those more upstream considerations, it can get pretty bad pretty quick. And just one kind of morbid example, and it's a hypothetical, but you'll see this in ethics texts where it'll talk about how if you're a utilitarian, if you're like greatest good for the greatest number of people, that's a consequentialist. Just look at what is the best effect, the best consequence. And you're a doctor, let's say, and you've got 5 patients, and one needs a heart, and one needs a lung, and one needs, and you go on. You have 5 patients; they all need different organs, and then this unsuspecting, nice young person walks through the door of your hospital, and you're like, whoa, that person looks totally healthy, greatest good for the greatest number of people. Bring them on in and do some surgeries. And so, utilitarianism, consequentialism, yes, consequences are important, but if that's the grounding, gets pretty crazy pretty quick.
Yeah, you need something beyond that to justify, or as you say, to ground right and wrong.
Because otherwise the end justifies the means.
Yeah. So as Christians, how should Christians think about right and wrong? How should we make these kind of decisions if, consequences are important, but they're not the sum total of it? How do Christians need to make these kind of decisions?
Well, for that, you're going to have to buy the book. No, I mean, we talk about this in the book, but I'll just really quickly go through kind of a threefold biblical way of figuring out what's right and wrong. I think biblically,
hit the highlights just real quick. Give us the summary, the Reader's Digest version.
It starts with the character of Christ, who models. This is what God is. This is who God, or this is what God cares about. The values and the virtues of Christ, and that's really what. As Christians, grounds our ethics. We look to him, and in the Sermon on the Mount, he was always getting back to the heart of things and the virtues and the values. And so it's worthwhile to just look at a gospel and say, all right, what does this tell me about what Jesus thinks is important? And we do that in the book, through the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus thinks that this is more important than this. It's more important to be good than to look good, and so on and so forth. So it starts with the character. That's the first C. Then you've got the commands of the Bible, and those are grounded in the character of God. The whole "be holy as I am holy." There is this prior kind of, we need to reflect our Creator. He created us in His image, and how do we do that? Well, we obey His commands. You imitate God's character by obeying God's commands. And the third C is, in fact, consequences. Consequences are important, and you look at, like I said, Proverbs. If you imitate God's character by obeying God's commands, the result will be good consequences at some level. Now, you could even be persecuted for it in this life, but there will be some good consequences that come from living out God's character by obeying His commandments. So it's those 3 C's, and it's in that order. Again, we imitate God's character by obeying God's commands, and the result is good consequences. And I think that is a pretty holistic way of looking at how Christians are able to discover, not invent, but discover what's right and wrong.
No, that's really good. And if I could add in not just a component that maybe sometimes gets left out, and I think is really important for us when we're discussing these things, the reason God's character that's reflected in his commands is good for us and will have good consequences. It's specifically because we're made in the image of God. And thus we're made to function how God functions. I think that's really important in that, so that it's not as if his character and his commands are thus arbitrary or somehow in opposition to our human nature. They're actually an expression of the very way our human nature is designed to function. And thus, when we keep God's commands and reflect his character, the ultimate reason that's good for us and has good consequences is because it's fulfilling our humanness. I always tell people, the more holy you are, the more human you are. That holiness is not contrary to your humanness. Holiness actually fulfills your humanness because you're made in God's image. So I think that's really important for us to keep all that together.
Oh, it's so good. It's a holistic view instead of an atomistic view where we separate these and make them, oppose each other. If we can, again, start with the character and move down from there, we may not get unified on every issue, but it will help us as we're grounding it in something we can all say, yeah, God is this way, isn't he? Yep, and go from there.
Yeah. And when my son was like 4 or 5, he went through a lying stage. A number of kids go through a lying stage, right? And so I was trying to put a little moral philosophy framework into his little 5-year-old brain, before I knew, I knew he couldn't fully understand it, but I'm setting the stage and we're playing the long game with kids, right? So there's little, 4 or 5-year-old Jeffrey, and Jeff, do you know why lying is wrong? No, Daddy. And so I would say to him, well, it's because you're made in the image of God. So you're made to be like God is. And God is truth. So when you lie, you not only assault the character of God, you also attack your own nature as well, and you ruin yourself. You got all those in there. You got God's character, you got God's command to be honest, and you got the consequences, right? You're destroying yourself. You're going to make it hard for me to trust you. You're going to make it harder for our relationship to flourish. You're going to become a person who lies more often, and now it's going to be harder for you to keep. I mean, there's all sorts of negative consequences that are going to come from not being a person of integrity and honesty that's reflected in God's character. And so we'd have this little conversation, and I'm trying to get him to think, theologically about lying. He was only 4 years old, but I'm setting a framework for playing the long game, and I just think that's kind of what the same thing we're doing here.
That's beautiful. After this episode, I need you to text that to me if you don't mind, because I've got kids, and I would love to steal that. So,
yeah, we had good conversations. My son, thankfully, he was philosophically wired from a young age, so I think it worked with him. But
nice.
Yeah. So let's jump to a specific issue that's an important issue in this realm of politics and culture, and that's really the issue of the sanctity of life, particularly when we're thinking about, say, abortion or in things related to that sanctity of life issue. If you're going to take this framework, these 3 C's that you laid out, could you just kind of help us give us an example, a model for how to think this issue through as a Christian, say abortion with your 3 C's, or the sanctity of life with these 3 C's?
Yeah, so I would, obviously start with character, which we kind of in the book branch out into both virtues and values. And I would ask, okay, what in the Bible shows us either virtues, what we are to be, or values, what we are to value, that connects with the abortion debate. And that would be the first step, is trying to think through this. Not consequentially. Now we will get to consequences, and just as an aside, we could be tempted to be consequentialist about this from the very get-go and say, well, I'll tell you what. The whole abortion debate, it used to win elections for the conservative. It doesn't win elections anymore, so it's really not that important. That would be an uber consequentialist approach to this topic. But we don't start with consequences. We start with character, and we say, okay, according to the Bible, what does God value? What are the virtues that God says for us to be that would inform our view our stance when it comes to abortion and infanticide? And
Can you
so,
give us
I'll give one.
like examples? Yeah.
Yeah. I would say, Jesus values both human life and he values children. And I think that that's something we have to soak in. We've got to make that part of our character. Is human life is. I mean, what was Jesus doing all the time? He was healing people, and he even said, is not a human worth more than far more than a sparrow. He's saying human life super important. It's how we image God. Made in the image of God. Male and female, he created him. Our embodiedness, our human life we are embodied. We're not just disembodied souls, but we are embodied. All of that is how we image God. So human life and children, and both of those, I think that really needs to inform our perspective.
What a statement of Jesus's, where he says, like, your father, the devil, has been a liar and a murderer since the beginning. Would that fit somehow into this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It seems like he's associating the destruction of human life with the devil's activity.
Which you see then in the Gospels with, this person is demon possessed. And so he either rolls into the fire, or rolls into the water, or this person lives among the tombs and gashes himself with stones and wails and as in cries. The idea is that, the devil comes, the enemy comes to steal and to kill and to destroy. And so, that's totally opposite of the Christian perspective.
Okay. So character.
And how would you answer that? What would you say is either a virtue or a value that should really inform us as we are dealing with this topic?
If we're talking specifically about the character of God, I think of God as creator and giver of life. I mean, it's not radically different. It's more like the flip side of what we were just talking about with the devil. The devil is the taker of life, destroyer. God's the creator and the giver of life, right? It's just who God is. It's what he did, right? So I think that would have to fit in there for me. Like, God as a person values life to such an extent that he gives it and creates it. He doesn't destroy it, right? I think that fits in there for me. When we talk about God's character, in him was life, and that life was the light of men. Jesus, describing the word Jesus in John chapter 1. So life is in him. So just the whole idea of life is associated with Jesus, with God, with their character, with who they are, with the essence of their being.
That's so good. And it's good to soak in that and not just to jump quickly to the next. It's like we need to be formed by the character of Christ.
Yeah. No, it's good. Okay. Next C, commands.
And so this would be asking, okay, are there some do's or do nots in the Bible that factor into this debate? Again, grounded in the character of God, are there commands he gives us that will help us to frame our stance? And so for me, the number one and most obvious and most important command here is do not murder.
Right.
You can try to get caught in some of the debates. Is this fetus really even a person yet? Do they have mind and will and emotions yet? Or are they kind of a pre-person, a potential person?
Right.
Well, look, the 10 commandments are very clear. Do not murder. Do not murder. What? Well, we're talking about human life. We're not even talking about this vague, notion of personhood, which, 10 different people won't have. We'll have 10 different views about what constitutes a person. That's not what matters. The Bible is very clear. Don't take human life. And that, that is that preborn baby is clearly a human life. What else could it be?
Right. And it seems to me that the debate over whether or not the preborn baby is a human is almost a tacit acknowledgement that we know deep in our bones murder is wrong. So in order to protect ourselves from the self-incriminating act of murder, we have to redefine what that fetus is. If we can say it's not a human, then we're not murdering, because we know deep in our that higher hardwiring, right? Deep in our hardwiring as human beings, we know that murder is wrong. So what fits that category? Well, this doesn't fit that category. Therefore, I'm safe, right? I think that's though, you know, in our own self-deception, we won't say that or acknowledge that. I do think that's sort of what's happening in that debate.
Yeah, for sure. There's a philosopher and ethicist, Michael Tooley, who had a very influential article on abortion and infanticide, and he basically argued, and joining the two together, which is significant: abortion, taking the life before birth, infanticide after, but arguing that we, you know, as a culture, we could experience so much more quality of life if we were to dial back the stigma of killing an infant or an unborn baby. That stigma, if that stigma went away, man, we could get rid of so much, so many things that weigh us down culturally. Well, what was his solution to that? His solution was, if we can take if we can separate the notion of human life from personhood, then we can destigmatize, abortion and infanticide, and then we can have a much better quality of life. Okay, so he's obviously looking at it in terms of consequentialism, right? We will have a better life if, and trace it back, and then he can only do that by dehumanizing a certain class of humans and say, well, they're not really persons. Which obviously that's what any mass murderer will do. They will take a group and say, well, you're not really quite up there. And by bringing in the idea of personhood, that's totally arbitrary. You could name any one of the steps along the process of development and say, well, now they're a person. Well, they're not really a person until this. Well, not really a person until they're born. Actually, they're not really a person until they're maybe 2. Right. Or they're not really a person until they're not dependent upon the mom anymore, which, okay, now they're 25, right? Because we're all, I mean, it's just totally arbitrary. We need to get back to being able to say, no, human life, we don't murder.
Have you, it's an older book now, but by Peter Kreeft, philosophy professor, Boston College, called The Unaborted Socrates. Have you ever heard of that book?
Heard of it, haven't read it.
So Kreeft had a series of these books back in the day where he would engage in key issues and discussions, and he would have Socrates, the great philosopher Socrates, magically come back from the dead and engage in contemporary discussions and dialogue using his dialogical approach to seeking truth. Yeah. So in this book, The Unaborted Socrates, the topic is abortion, and Socrates comes back to life at Harvard University and has these discussions about abortion with people in modern culture. It's a fascinating read because what Kreeft attempts to do is deal with this very issue of personhood and humanness. But even though Kreeft was a conservative Catholic scholar, right, and philosopher, without using scripture, his point is we could still argue for the wrongfulness of abortion by simply acknowledging logically the personhood of the preborn baby. And so, I think that issue is really important for us to consider. So,
and I would love to hear that argument, because I do agree that you probably could make a strong case for the personhood, depending upon how you define that. Or I've heard, for the potential personhood, but I still think that there is a real danger in making it about something that is so potentially arbitrary as personhood, because it's what Nancy Pearcey in her book, Love Thy Body, wonderful book. It's what she talks about, that if we're able to shift the focus from a human life with a body, and just make it a whole lot more spiritual, then it becomes kind of that fact value split. And we can kind of consign it into, well, if you're religious, then maybe you'll see a soul here, a person here, or whatever. But when it comes to actual factually, it's just a blob of tissue or whatever. So, so I think that there probably is room for an argument for the personhood of preborn baby, but I think that it's probably safer on more safe grounds to be able to locate it in. Hey, it's a human life. And if you're going to say that it's okay to abort that human life, the burden of proof is on you to show why this is not a human life worth protecting.
Yeah. We're running a little bit short on time in this episode, Daniel. So I want to, because this is so central to the book, where you give this framework, these 3 C's, and then we actually, give people the opportunity to walk through some of the issues and think them through themselves. So it's very central. So I think it would be helpful to people if we could finish this conversation with you saying, okay, so how would I summarize then what I've learned in a statement, so they could have a model as they read the book and think through these issues themselves? Not that they have to imitate exactly what you do, but you're just to show them, guide them a little bit. So summarize then how taking the character, the commands, and the consequences, summarize that into a statement, and that becomes sort of a guiding statement for how you as a Christian are going to think through this particular issue of abortion here.
Yeah. And I really like encouraging people, and I've done this with my students as well in my ethics class, encouraging them to develop a stance about a question, as well as if it's a decision that they need to make. So whether it's like a long-term stance about a particular topic, or whether it's, hey, I've got this issue, I got to figure this out, I got to figure this out by Monday. Either way, this framework helps with that. So you soak first in the character, what issues of virtue and value factor into this, then the commands, and then the consequences. And I'll just say one more thing before I get to your question, which is, how would I actually do this with the abortion debate? There's kind of a third element in there that I don't want to miss, and that is like questions of fact. When it comes to ethical questions, we have to be able to also think through, okay, what are the most consequential questions of fact here? Because I don't want to think that I'm obeying God, but it really doesn't connect up with the decision that I've made here. So questions like, okay, is the preborn baby an actual human life? Questions like that. So anyway, all that to say, if that was muddled, I apologize. But what I encourage people to do is to say, all right, as a person of, and then fill in the blank with character, I will obey the commands of God to, and then fill in with the commands that apply by, and then here's the decision that I've made or the stance that I'm going to take. And then fourthly, in such a way that, and then fill in with consequences. And so the consequences that I want to have happen, because that is important. So I might say something like this: as a person who values human life and who values children, I will obey the Bible's command to not murder, and the command to let the little children come and to welcome them, by supporting pro-life laws in such a way that I don't, and then here are the consequences that I either want to have happen or that I don't want to have happen, in such a way that I am not heaping shame on people who have had abortion, but that I invite people into the life-giving love of Christ. Now, there's so much more to be said there, but that's at least a snapshot of how I would encourage somebody really soak in this stuff, all 4 elements, in order to be able to say, all right, this is my stance, or this is my decision.
No, that's good. I think just having that succinct statement for yourself, obviously, when we walk through that process, super helpful to be able to take this big, broad, fuzzy, all these different things, issues, and boil it down to say, no, because of my faith, I'm going to be guided by Scripture, thus the character of God, the commands of God, and so on and so forth. So having that clear statement is helpful to me. But just now, for you to give it to our listeners, is really helpful. So if they're going to read the book and they have all these issues that they need to think through, that's going to affect who they vote for and how they vote, and which policies they're going to promote and support and why, this is going to help, I think, really take what feels like a big, muddy mess of an ethical issue. How can I think that through simply and clarify that? That's kind of the intent and the goal of this section of the book. And that's why we have those 6 or 7 chapters in the middle where, all right, let's take these big topics, take this framework, and now as a, to be guided by your Christian convictions, let's think this through clearly. So super helpful.
Yeah, I think it'll be a whole lot more helpful than just the gut reactions, the quick takes, and this is what my political platform says, so therefore this is what Christianity must teach. Really soak in these things. And I think that you'll find that not only do you come up with, I think this is a very good biblical stance, but I think you'll also find that it can help persuade others as well.